Ben, common question. Do I need to have the debt plane landed by the time I enjoy lifestyle by design fully, or can I have a little bit of residual debt in the background? Our planners go through this time and time again, week by week, answering this question, Ben.
All the time. And I'm going to take some liberties here too, Bryce, in terms of, because we've got lots of themes on this question. So I'm going to try and put a little bit of a different slant because we've got some other questions there. Now, I'm going to say to Richard and to anyone in our community who's listening, the idea that you fully pay off your home before you potentially invest in your first property, I'm not necessarily a big advocate of that, because there is ultimately a challenge with the time that you have left. And that's where Richard finds himself in now, a situation where if he's got a fully paid off home, and that gives him lots of security. I get that. Part of what we're trying to teach people about investing is trapping surplus and paying some of that into your mortgage, but also putting that other money to use, so you don't necessarily find yourself in this position. So, Richard, that's why I love your question, because it does allow us to say no judgment here in terms of you can't change the past. But my first piece of advice to anyone is, if you are thinking about, I'll start investing once I've got the home paid off, you're actually robbing yourself of the power of compound over time. So that's my first point there. In terms of the reference to how we look at, basically when or what time, or is it okay in terms of paying out that loan, there's a bit of work that we need to do here, and that is we need to understand someone's working income and when does that working income stop, because that's going to give us an indication in terms of, well, by the time you, i.e., retire, being, sort of 65 or whatever it is, what do we project in terms of how that current situation looks? And then it's about sort of converting the costs. So when we're sort of saying, okay, do I need to have it fully funded by retirement? Well, we then start to look at a couple of other interesting things. Is the property paying its own way? In other words, is it covering all of the costs associated with that? Our preference then is ultimately to try and get it to that situation. But even if it's not at that situation, we also have got another basket of liquidity and opportunities for us to think about. And that basket can be things like the ability to how we might fund a further reduction of that mortgage as a lump sum. So we might decide to downsize from our principal place of residence because it's no longer fit for purpose in terms of our needs. So we might get a lump sum and then pay that down. We might also then have a look at access to our super. And as part of getting access to that super, it may be sensible, and again, case by case situation, where you might pay a portion of that onto the debt, which is then allowing that rental income to start flowing through as part of that passive income story. So, from where I sit, this is a story of, if I'm 52 and I want to invest in property, how can I eventually pay it off? We want to see at least a minimum of 10 years of being able to comfortably support and hold that property. So anyone who's potentially thinking about investing, it doesn't guarantee success by holding it for a decade, but it does mitigate and reduce a lot of the risks in terms of if there's any short-term challenges in the market. So for mine, it's a really powerful question about what does it need to look like in retirement. Preferably, it needs to be paying its own way, but it certainly doesn't have to be fully paid out. And I think a lot of people make that mistake, thinking that it's got to be debt-free by the time they retire their working income. And that's not necessarily the case, but it's got to be effectively analysed in terms of how are we going to hold or get out of that property. And some of our clients who are later in life, who have a preference for residential property as their investment vehicle, we might have hold periods of 10, 15 years before we do potentially forecast a sale of that property. Now, whether we actually sell it in 15 years' time is not the case. It's the scenarios that we might be building to give the confidence around what that looks like.
Yeah, it's important stuff. You've covered a lot of ground there, folks. So I reckon if you want to rewind and re-listen to that, there was some gold, right? Because it's whether or not the properties or your property portfolio is self-funding once there's no more working income. That's the critical part, because you want You want the portfolio to be able to provide you with an income. If you're no longer got any working income, the portfolio has got to give you enough money in substitute for the working income so that you can fund the lifestyle that you want. That's one. And two, you need to be able to fund if there's any debt residual left. So that's really what it comes down to. But I think the important message that you said in that part, Ben, was that at the very top of your answer, which is around the fact that don't think that these are stepping stones. You need to pay off the home, then you can invest in property, because that ignores the fundamental premise of what makes
Yeah.
property investing so great and what makes it as a passive investment so great is the fact that the longer you've had your name on the title before you get to retirement, the better, and the more the magic that kicks in here. So the amount of times you have the conversations with people saying, now I've paid off the home, what's next? I think is synonymous with this question. And again, Richard, the fact that you've paid off your home is to just double click on Ben's point is phenomenal, right? But now you're 52, and when was the reasonable amount of time that you actually wanted to retire? Did you have 60 as the benchmark? Did you see yourself working till 70? These are really, really important questions. But I think to Ben's point, the longer that you can be in the game. Now you're 52. So, and you haven't invested in property, and it's not too late. So I think it's the reinforcing point here for you. And but you would really want to be having a really good eye on risk profile, what the end line is, so that we know how many years that we're working for, so that you could get a better understanding of what type of properties you would actually be investing in. What is the priority in the properties that you're getting? Because clearly, if our timeline is a little earlier, we are well and truly having conversations that capital growth is the one and only master that we want to serve wherever we can. But as we move closer to a transition to retirement, that really needs to be taken into account, because if we don't have the lever of time that we can play with here, that will definitely impact whether it's a growth property, a balanced property, a yield property, Ben.
Yeah, it does. I think that's one of the other things that you mentioned nicely there, Bryce, is the strategy has got to be informed by the cash flow and also the time to retirement and the working time and all those other things. So usually if we are starting later in life, having more yield as part of that particular conversation, if we're taking on some debt, is going to be part of our considerations in terms of how we might advise at a one-to-one level on a case-by-case basis. But generally speaking, you don't want to be taking on a huge amount of debt and leverage the later you are in life. It should be more balanced in terms of that. That's why the other basket of funds in terms of assets, downsizing, access to lump sum of cash or those types of things are going to influence the decision that you should make.
And that's also assuming, Ben, that everyone wants to do what we do, get
Yeah.
multiple properties that give you a passive income. Richard, you could possibly buy uh, one investment property at 52 and go to sell it at 62. And if you've bought the right property in the right location, the right area, in the right part of the cycle, chances are that property's doubled in value. And once you net off your selling costs, you might have a big lump sum of money that you would be quite happy. So instead of receiving an annuity style income, which is what we're advocating for, so it goes on forever, you might just be happy with a lump sum that you can draw on, that you can actually help you fund maybe 5 or 10 years worth of your retirement, right? But for us, the nirvana is the constant passive nature that year after year, the portfolio is going to continue to spit off cash flow that allows you, and if you do it well and it's part of your goal, you can have generational impact. So that's the nirvana. But Ben, I think it's important to highlight here that if someone does have an investment property and it's only for 10 years and they do have to sell, chances are they're going to be better off than a lot of people who don't do anything in the same situation. So again, it's being clear on what the exit game is. Our exit game is an infinite game. We want to stay in the game for as long as we can, but some people might just see it as a short term,
Yep.
let's get in it for a decade and liquidate after that.